Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and thanks for stopping by again. From time to time, people write me and ask me to compare Panama to some other Latin American country, and I do my best to answer. It's very difficult to do it. To make a proper comparison, you have to live in both countries for a substantial period of time to get to know them well. But basically, because I don't see Panama as being in competition with others, and I really do encourage people to do their own research, to visit any countries they think are worth their time and make their own judgment. But one nation that we're frequently compared to and people frequently write me about is Costa Rica. And that comes about for a very simple reason. People look at a map and they see this little tiny country called Panama and this little tiny country called Costa Rica. And they're right beside each other. They share a common border. Videos from websites and what have you from the two countries look surprisingly alike, but really they must be very similar to each other. So what's the difference between these two countries? And the truth is there is distinctly a difference between the two nations. They are very different, but much of it roots back in history, comes all the way up to the present time. They have both been on paths that have occasionally touched each other, but rarely. They've been often side by side, but really headed in different directions, and the results are evident today. Now, that doesn't mean that one is better than the other, just that they are different paths that they've taken. Now, we go back to the Spanish colonial period, some 500 years ago, and what it was all about in the beginning, of course, as you might imagine, you probably have heard, the gold and the silver from the Inca Empire in Peru and Ecuador and around that whole area of the Andes. That was what the Spanish were particularly interested in. They would load it at their main city they developed down there, Lima, Peru, and it would be shipped up to Panama City, what is Panama City today, moved across this narrow bridge of land, and then loaded again onto ships in the Atlantic that took them on back to Spain. So I'm going to use the word Panama and the words Costa Rica. Remember, neither one of these countries existed back then. But what was Panama at that day was intimately tied to what was going on in South America, and it was considered to be part of South America, even though it seemed to stick away from the rest of it. It seemed to be separate. It wasn't. It had nothing to do with a map. The Spanish still had to develop their maps. What it had to do with was what its importance was to the empire, and it was a passageway, a transit, that got that gold and that silver into Madrid's hands. They wanted it. So there's no question from Spain's perspective that that whole route from Lima all the way up to Panama City and across to Madrid, that was one area. And they called that a viceroyalty. The whole empire, Spanish empire was huge. You know, it went from California down to the tip of South America. It had to be divided up into separate administrative sections. And Panama was part of the viceroyalty of Peru, and thus Lima was where people who lived here 400 or 500 years ago looked to for direction and for administration. People who are now in what is now Costa Rica were in a different viceroyalty, and they looked to Mexico City. So the two areas were separated, so to speak, by the Spanish themselves, and the line that separated the two viceroyalties, basically, more or less, very close to the same as the border between Costa Rica and Panama today. So they were very different from the very beginning. Panama had a very special role to play in that empire that was quite different than the role that was to be played by Costa Rica. And thus they were divided administratively. And nobody was thinking in terms of what was going to be true in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries or so forth. They were just concerned with what was true right then and there. So from the beginning, there was that difference. It continued for well over 3 centuries. Then we have, in the 19th century, the 1800s, independence came. The Spanish Empire went through decline and lost control. And countries began to develop where once there had been colonies. Costa Rica and the Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and so forth, were all created in that period. Panama was still not part of that. It was a part of a new nation, originally called Gran Colombia, but it is now today Colombia. So 115 years ago, if you came, this is February 2018, in February of 1903, if you arrived here, you would be surrounded by Colombians. It wasn't until November of that year that Panama separated from Colombia and became an independent republic. So throughout the 19th century, Panamanians were, in effect, Colombians. Even though this area was called Panama, they were Colombians, no question. And they sought independence. They wanted it, but they couldn't get it. Colombia was simply too powerful. Meantime, in the Central American republics, and that's what they were called, they tried to form one Central American republic in the early 1800s, and it failed. They kept it up for a few years, but it just didn't work. And there were sporadic attempts throughout the 1800s to try to recreate this Central American republic. Panama was never associated with any of that. It was part of Colombia, and Colombia really would have trouble caring less about what these little tiny Central American republics were doing. That might be annoying to them, but certainly they never considered being part of that or considered them to be part of Colombia. Not at all. They didn't really care, to be truthful. So folks here were not involved in that. And that's when the term Central American became significant. It was the area, the countries between Mexico and Panama. And right on into the early 20th century, now we have both Costa Rica and Panama existing as independent nations. The tradition, and it was true when I was studying Latin America many years ago, decades past, that this region was referred to as Mexico, Central America, and Panama. Mexico and Panama were seen as very different from Central America. It just was. When I first came down in 2004, I was up in where I was living at the time in Bethesda, Maryland, in the U.S., and I was talking to a gentleman, I don't know, Nicaragua, Honduras, whatever, who was working where I stayed, and in chatting, and I said, I'm going to be living in Central America too. And he said, really? He said, where? And I said, Panama. And he looked me right in the eye, and he said very seriously, Panama is not part of Central America. And it's true. And that, I immediately knew, of course, it makes sense, but I hadn't really stopped to think about it yet. Once I looked into it and thought about it, I realized, yeah, it is true. So throughout this period, Central America has gone its way, and Panama has gone its way, and there have been quite a few differences between them that turned right into the 20th century. After all, in the 20th century, the Americans arrived, the canal was built, the zone was set up, everything changed in Panama. Costa Rica, no, it was a different situation. And finally, in the second half of the 20th century, Costa Rica really came into, it bloomed, so to speak, as far as North Americans were concerned. They'd given up their military, and they had a stable country, and they accepted the dollar along with their own currency. So a lot of retired Americans and Canadians, if they were going to live in this part of the world, came down to Costa Rica. Panama was in no condition to accept people like that. It was not set up for that. It was going through a very different stage in its own history. Costa Rica seemed to be the island of stability and democracy, and to some extent at least to private enterprise in that period. And it was very popular. So when I told people I was moving down in this direction, Americans would frequently say, oh, you mean Costa Rica? And I said, no, Panama. Costa Rica became the automatic reaction of Americans who'd ever given any consideration to retiring in Latin America. In truth, there were two areas that were really popular, and one was Costa Rica, the other was Mexico, which, after all, people in the southwestern U.S., all they had to do was get in a car and drive across the border, and they were there. So Mexico has always had the largest American community there. Last I heard, the embassy expected something over 1 million people. They don't know exactly how many. So it's a very large community, but it's a big country and a large population. So it's a nation area in itself, and today it's considered to be part of North America. As far as everybody down here is concerned, and formally and officially, it's Latin America, but it's also North America. Panama, too, has long been considered part of South America. It continued to be for very obvious reasons because it was South American in its background. In fact, Wikipedia has sections up on the continents, and up until about 6 or 7 years ago, Panama was included in the South American section. And then suddenly they changed it and put it in the North American section. Truth is, it's a bridge between the two. And it really, today, I wouldn't call it either North American or Central or South American, certainly not Central American, but just simply Panama. However, we've gotten used to be called Central American Republic of, and so Panamanians don't really care. If you want to call them Central American, that's fine. They don't mind. But it's not really historically accurate. In fact, if you do visit both countries and you really get involved with them, you'll discover that Costa Rica and Panama speak different versions of Spanish. And that comes from the past as well. There are, well, I won't go into all the detail of that, but it's simply true. And although they can understand each other, for heaven's sakes, and certainly those who live near the border have gotten very used to this. There's no problem. It's not that tricky. It's a bit like, I guess you might say, British English and American English, but it's a little bit more different than that. But it's easy for both countries' peoples to understand the other one and to pick up the differences between the two. Yet, that's a real fact, and our Spanish is much more closely associated, no surprise, with Colombian Spanish. So you have all this going on in this period, and then you're at the end of this last half of the the 20th century, and Costa Rica is doing quite well. Panama is going through some severe difficulties politically and otherwise. Costa Rica is very popular for retirees who are coming down at that stage of the game. This seems to be the way it is, and nobody was really prepared for the 21st century. I don't think anybody predicted what would happen in the 21st century. But what did happen, really, right around that time, I know centuries don't really mean anything in one sense, but in fact, there was a major shift that went on. It went on here. What had happened in both countries is that they had, the superficial aspects had become similar. Panama gave up its military, just like Costa Rica had. Costa Rica had given their military up because they had a civil war in 1948. And a portion of their military fought the Civil War with another portion of their military. It was very nasty. And as a result of that, some time later, they just decided no military. And that had been fine. Panama also went that route in the 1990s as they dealt with the aftermath of Emmanuel Noriega's regime. And they gave it up. Panama's always had the U.S. dollar, so that was no big difference there. But Panama had to straighten out who it was now and where it wanted to go. And, of course, the most important event in the history of the nation in the last 200-300 years was the turnover of the canal in 2000. And suddenly Panama became one nation completely. From one end to the other, it was their home, their nation, and they were in control. That was a critical moment, and psychologically as well as in many other aspects here. And off we started in the 21st century. At that point in time, the two nations were pretty much at the same level of economic development in terms of statistics like per capita gross domestic product, GDP, per capita wealth. Because I often mention to people, it's not just how much money you make, it's how many mouths you have to feed. So technically, Costa Rica's GDP was higher than Panama's, but they also had a higher population. But in effect, we were almost exactly the same and continued that way for a couple of years, and then Panama started to pull up. And now what was going on at that time in the early years of the 21st century is that the government here in Panama made up its mind that it wanted to be a center for logistics, a center for business throughout the entire region. It was very ambitious activity. And in 2007, laws were passed that were meant to attract international business to come and set up their headquarters and their offices here in Panama City. Now, a number of them had already had their headquarters up in San Jose in Costa Rica because it was the stable center where they felt comfortable. Now, things changed. So in 2007, two international corporations set up their headquarters here under this law. As of today, we have 146 corporations from all over the world who have followed that same direction. They've come down here and set up. So we became the center for international business. We've expanded the canal. Our airport's gone through multiple growth, enlargements, and now the second terminal coming down, a third terminal in the planning stages, and so forth. The country really took off from a business viewpoint, and the canal expansion of the canal has been a brilliant thing. It's worked extremely well. All along through this first couple decades in the 21st century, Panama was really, really dramatically growing. Its rate of growth was far above that of Costa Rica's, so that today, in terms of things like per capita GDP, we're substantially ahead of Costa Rica. Our unemployment rate usually runs half or more or less of that up in Costa Rica. Panamanians rarely go to Costa Rica to find jobs, but we have a lot of Costa Ricans who come in here looking for work. They're welcome. The two countries get along just fine. We don't really think about each other. I can't really speak for Costa Ricans, but Panamanians don't think about it. They really don't, unless there's a problem, and there isn't with Costa Rica. With Colombia, we've had our problems because of the drug trafficking, but not with Costa Rica. So there's absolutely no sense of unhappiness between these two countries that means anything at all. And throughout history, they've run their separate paths, so they're quite used to it. But here, the economy has truly taken off. And the economies are different. The history is different. As a result, the politics of the two countries, although they're both democracies, elections are freely held in both. The political systems and the political parties are not exactly the same in the two nations. They're different. The language is different. There are all these differences combined. So, in effect, when you come here, that's what's happening. You are seeing two little countries on a map that seem to be almost identical. In fact, they're not. What is the benefits of living in one or the other? It boils down to. I think that most of us divide into two broad groups, and there's one group that basically lives on the surface of the society, engaging with it from time to time, but really sort of separate from it all. And so the difference between the two is probably not going to be very great. Certainly, real estate in Costa Rica is not cheaper than it is in Panama. In fact, it's argued that it's more expensive. I don't know, but it certainly isn't cheaper. So people don't choose it for that. But the Ticos is what they call themselves. T-I-C-O, Tico, is a Costa Rican. The Ticos do a fantastic job of eco resorts and of using the environment and the ecology that they have far more effectively in drawing people in. They've had to depend a great deal on attracting people with their natural beauty because they don't have a canal, because they don't really have a product that they produce that is especially popular. So what they've done is they've created some really wonderful places to visit. And frankly, if there was any envy from Panama, it's that they've done such a fine job. We're developing our eco resorts and so forth here too, but we still have quite a ways to go before we catch up with them. But on our side of the coin, it has not depended on tourism, although tourism has grown hugely in this country in the last few years. Nonetheless, the simple fact of the matter is that we're a much more diversified economy than most people think. And it's not just the canal. It's a lot more than that. But that's for another video at some other time. It is not only diversified, it's been very successful. And we've been the leader in growth in the Western Hemisphere everywhere, from Canada to Chile, for most of the time for the last 15 so years. Once in a while, we come in second or third or something of this sort. But usually, as we did last year, the year before, we're number one, and we're going to be, maybe this year, they say we will again. We don't care. These are the sort of numbers games other people play with. If you actually look at the policies and you see how things are developed here and how they're actually operated, not in, in somebody's imagination, but in reality, you recognize the country has a very clear path ahead of it in terms of its economy as it develops itself as a logistics hub for all of Latin America, and particularly for Central America and North and South America. Now, and it's working, and they are very clear on what they want. It's interesting to note that Singapore, which is a country that we're often compared with, they have set up what they call a global center of excellence over in Singapore. And these centers of excellence exist in different countries around the world. They're usually a partnership between the government and a major private corporation entity that is particularly skilled at the area that they're interested in improving. Singapore had a global center of excellence in logistics. And heaven knows Singapore is very famous for its logistics capability. And the company that dealt with them was DHL, which if you haven't heard of them and you're from North America, they're somewhat similar to FedEx, but they are far more than that. They are really a logistics firm of the first order, and one I respect a lot because they do a great deal of research and work on understanding countries and their development. Really very fascinating. And they have worked with Singapore in that center of excellence to even strengthen already strong reputation of Singapore. It's been quite successful. So this year it was met with pleasure to hear that Panama will now have a global center of excellence, and we will also be dealing with logistics, and our partner will be DHL. So our attitude is, if it worked with Singapore, these are the people we want working with us, and that's happening right now. And it's a perfect fit because the people who are in charge of making we have a plan for 2030. This is all working toward that goal. The folks here who are concerned with that are very smart people. They're very sharp, but they really prefer to also have input from outside, from someone who can walk in and knows what they're talking about and can be critical and helpful and supportive in what they're doing. And this is exactly what they've done. And they've chosen an excellent partner, somebody who's already been through that in another nation and quite successfully. So we have all this going on. Costa Rica does not have going on. So we have well past them now in economic statistics. Let's put it this way, they pay a lot more in interest when they borrow money. Their bonds are typically considered to be speculative, sometimes referred to as junk bonds. Once in a while, they get a bit above that. Ours are firmly in the investment grade level, several notches above theirs, and we pay a lot less in interest when we borrow money because we're considered to be financially in better shape, or more responsible, and more successful with our economy. And this is the people who've got the big bucks are moving around the world. This is the decision they make, and they don't care about the politics of the country. They care about what they do if it's unstable, but they are looking for a good place, a place they feel is going to pay its bills. And that's why it was very much a surprise here, really, because we don't, again, make a fuss over these things. But Bloomberg Financial News Service has reported a while back, I'll put a link down underneath this video, to make the announcement that Panama was now considered to be the best credit risk in Latin America. Well, we've come up to tie, basically, with Chile, who's always been number one in this regard. But we're passing them, and we're likely to pass them this year. But we don't care. Again, we're not in competition with Chile. But it is interesting to note that no other nation in Latin America gets a better deal and interest rates than Panama does, and it's for a very good reason. That 20 years ago would not have been the case. 10 years ago wouldn't have been the case. Today it's the case, and it says a lot right there. Meantime, across the border, they're having a struggle up there. So that can have an effect on life in the nation, and but you probably won't feel as much of it if you're living on the surface. If you're really more involved in the country itself, you'll feel it. I think the most apparent physical difference is that people have noted time and time again who come down. To begin with, San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica, is quite different than Panama City, and I guess in the eyes of people, we're much more modern and much more dynamic. Whatever, that's a subjective judgment. But one thing is for sure, we have a much better infrastructure. And a lot of money has gone in the last couple of decades to improving the road infrastructure here, as well as airports and everything else. A terrific amount of work has gone into it, and it's true. We probably have the best road infrastructure of anybody in our region, and that includes Costa Rica. So that's something you might feel on a day-to-day basis. We also have lower taxes. You'll pay a lot more for gasoline in Costa Rica than you will here. Traditionally, in Central America, they're the most expensive. And when we're compared to Central America, we're less expensive than any of them. So it's a variety of these things that all fit together that have made Panama an economic success. So what does that mean to you? And the answer is, it just helps you understand that there are two different countries here. And we don't see ourselves as carbon copies of each other. We have no argument with each other. We have excellent relations with each other, but we do take separate paths. We've ended up in separate places, and we're moving in separate directions. You, meantime, you're going to have to find whether or not that difference means anything to you or not. If you you go to Costa Rica, you see a place, you really love it. I mean, it's wonderful. Well, by all means, stay there. I mean, my feelings aren't going to be hurt at all. I mean, it's all about you and what meets your standards. And then it's what meets my standards. Now, I made my decision back in 2004. I have never regretted it for one single second. And I'm going to stay right here. But that doesn't mean the same for you or somebody else. I always point this out because I get tired of people trying to push me into saying, oh, don't go to Costa Rica. Come down to Panama. We're so much better. I mean, I'm not going to waste my time on that. I shared some information with you today, and I tell you, yeah, I'm convinced I'm in the right location. But there are people across that border who disagree with me, and I know that. And I have respect for them and their opinions as well. You have to just look at each country as it stands itself. The more information you can get about that country that goes into more detail than is standard in a 500-word essay or something up on the internet in some commercial website is going to do you a lot of good. There's a lot of information in places like Wikipedia and so forth. I'm right now working on my next report from Panama. I'm only doing them now about once a year because there's so much, and at the same time things continue to move in the same direction, so I don't write it until I really have a block of time to do it in, and I really don't have that, but I'm making it now. I'm sort of forcing myself to sit down and put things together for this report, which will go into more detail about Panama, but I'm not going to be commenting on Costa Rica or Ecuador or Uruguay or any of the other fine countries in this region. I'm focused right here on Panama, and that's what's important, but it may help provide you, maybe not. I'll let you know when it comes, and you're welcome to a copy of it. When I do this, my reports tend to be quite detailed and run on for quite a few pages, and they're just my contribution from my particular perspective. Now, you need to make your perspective, and any way I can help with that is fine with me. I will take one moment at the end here to say what really set me to decide to do something today. It was a recent message received from one of you, one of the videos. A gentleman told me that apparently it was a podcast that he'd heard from a site dedicated to Costa Rican real estate, apparently. And the process, they insisted they had no agenda, that they were completely unbiased. But one of the speakers, apparently, I was told, said that in Panama, Americans, or people talking about Americans, but people outside could only own 49% of a home. And they bought a house, 51% of it would have to be owned by a Panamanian, 49% left to the American. He said, is that true? I said, absolutely not true. I mean, it's ridiculous. Absolutely. So occasionally, this sort of nonsense goes on. So what I'm telling you now is that I'm mentioning it because this gentleman reminded me that there are people who make some outrageous statements in comparing themselves to Panama. For things like this is fake news of the first order. Just use common sense. If this were the case and we couldn't own our homes 100%, there would be very few people here. You wouldn't be seeing Americans and Canadians and Europeans rushing down here so that they could, give 51% of the control of their house to somebody else who happened to be a Panamanian. It doesn't make any sense. It's totally ridiculous. You wouldn't do it in your own country. You own your own home. It's exactly the same here. It's exactly the same in Costa Rica. So when you hear something that outrageous, just reject it, immediately reject it. And when you reject it, keep it in your mind, this is not a website I can trust, whatever that website might be. Or especially if it's repeated or becomes part of their general thing. If it was a guest who said something like that and they didn't correct him, then that's sort of too bad. That's terrible. But on the other hand, it just doesn't make sense. It's because it isn't true. And that's an extreme thing. It should never have happened. And yet there'll be people who will be concerned because they want to know. And I don't blame them for asking. The gentleman who wrote me did exactly the right thing and asking me if it was true. And I could take care of that in 30 seconds. It was so easy to take care of. So you can feel free to ask these sorts of things, too, if you see fit to. But, again, you can wade through most of the BS if you put your minds to it, because so much of it is extreme, and it just doesn't make any sense. So when that occurs, just ignore it, regardless of what country you're reading about. And that includes Germany, United States, Japan, China, and everybody else. It's get out there and ask questions and see for yourself and look for the answers, the real answers, and use common sense, and you're going to be fine. So, viva Costa Rica and viva Panama. And thank you very much for stopping by. I look forward to seeing you again.